Shout out and love it, and we'll turn things over to Andrea to actually lead us, and I'll stop talking for a moment.
I'm only gonna ask her questions, so we're gonna get her talking in just a second. Okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm starting a timer so that we can know how long we're talking. There we go. Okay, so I'm just gonna assume that unlike me, you all haven't read this whole book cover to cover and written lots of things in the margins already, that you're here to find out more about it. So I've put together a set of questions that I think are going to get Devoney to talk to us a little bit about the inspiration for the book, the ideas in the book, why we should care about the book. That's not a why should we care about this book question, but to sort of talk about placing it in the larger history of ways we think about Jane Austen. So I have written down questions, and I realize that I need reading glasses to read my piece of paper, so I'm going to do this terrible on and off thing. But the first question I want to ask you is about the title and the word wild. And as I was reading it, I will admit I felt like there were lots of different definitions of the word wild operating. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you settled on the word wild instead of unconventional or lots of other words one might have chosen. Why is that word sitting in the title, and why is it so important to you, and sort of what does it mean in terms of this book?
I love this question. Thanks for this as a way to start us off. When I was conceiving of the title for this, I loved that there was a dual meaning in it. Wild for Austen is what is wild in Austen's life and writings, but also who has gone wild for Austen, who has gone wild over Austen. And so the book is divided into three parts about her writings, her life, and her legacy. So wild for in a lot of senses. But I'm also, as I know Andrea is a big word geek, and we love to teach about the history of words, and I wanted to try to find in Austen's writings and all these other parts, what is positively wild? Wild can have some negative meanings too, then and now, but it struck me so much in her writings is it's a linchpin word. Wild is a linchpin word, looking at the positive ways, especially that women are wild. And so I especially wanted to tease that out. And then the publisher likes to add the subtitle with the other words that are supposed to grab you. So that's where we got, rebellious and subversive and untamed. But I think unconventional would also work quite well. And Austen has traditionally been described as a very mild author, a prim and proper author. And I think those of us in the Jane Austen study of North America are wise that that is not the case. Those in the Academy are wise that that's not the case. But the general public maybe hasn't come quite as far as it ought, I think, to move Austen from the mild side to the wild side of understanding that word. And the way that I'm describing wild in the introduction as a sense of passion and purpose, a kind of unconventionality that can be political, but that also can be about a personal style. Wild can be a positive personal style in this age, in the Regency era in the early 19th century. And there is one moment in Austen's writings where she says, "If I am a wild beast, I cannot help it. It is not my own fault." And I love that, and I think that it gets at the spirit of what I'm trying to bring out in the book. Is that sort of where you were hoping I would go with that as a way to start out?
I like the emphasis on the positive nature of the word wild, which I think often has negative connotations. And I think it's worth even pushing more. So I was just jotting down, you said passion, purpose, personal style. That wildness might be about behavior, it might be about ideas, it might be about
desire. I think it can be about desire.
Yeah, right? It can be lots of different things, and I think that flexibility in the word is part of what's really interesting. You started to say some things about how people think about Jane Austen as mild. And so I'm actually going to read a line back at you out of your own book.
Now I'm scared.
No. So there's a chapter really late in the book in which Devoney talks about a movie version of Pride and Prejudice that never got made, which is a fun way to think about possibility. But there's a line towards the very end of the chapter. "I'm convinced that this movie, had it been made, would have changed Austen adaptation history." And I'm really fascinated by the idea that interpretation begets interpretation, that sort of ways of talking about Austen have fostered certain ideas in people's minds for a very long time, and if people had talked about her in different ways earlier, we might be talking about her in other ways now, like this kind of weird legacy sort of thing. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think public sentiment about Jane Austen in the past has shaped ideas about her in the present. Like if you can sort of trace some of that, whatever it is you're pushing back against.
Absolutely. I think what I'm pushing against, what many of us, I'm not the first to do this, are pushing against, is this sense that her collateral descendants, some of her siblings, told us that she lived a boring life of no event. This is like almost a direct quote from the first biographies of her by her brother and then by her nephew and great-nephew. Nothing happened. The easy will be the task of the mere biographer, says one of these, the idea that absolutely nothing happened to her is clearly bunk.
Yeah.
But there have always been people who said that they were lying, or who said that they were misrepresenting. And this goes back to the 1820s even, where there were people who were noticing things about her that were less in line with this idea of someone who would never step beyond the most strict propriety. And I think that has been cool to try to bring out. So the quote that you brought out is really a pop culture quote.
Yeah.
So if we've got these relatives and they're going up against these other people who are describing Jane Austen in certain ways, by the 20th century, now we have stage adaptations and film adaptations, and I really am sorry that this musical version of Pride and Prejudice was not made in 1947, because slated to play Elizabeth Bennet was Judy Garland. And I think had Judy Garland been Elizabeth Bennet, we would be talking about this text and pop culture very differently. I think one of the ways that we could see this is Darcy is now absolutely has taken all the oxygen out of the room, and I'm not saying I'm not part of the problem there. I'm one of these people who might think a little too often about Colin Firth in ways that must be for research purposes, but maybe not entirely. So I do think that had Judy Garland given us this strong, amazing Elizabeth that she is likely to have given us, because she's so charismatic and so powerful an actor and a singer, I do think maybe we wouldn't be having what we sometimes in the jazz world call the Darcy Wars, right? Where we're like, which Darcy is the best Darcy? As if this is the most important question, we've limited ourselves to that question, I think, in some ways. So this Pride and Prejudice that's coming out from Netflix, Jack Lowden from Slow Horses is slated to be the next Darcy. But I think it's just as interesting that Emma Corrin, a non-binary actor, is slated to play Elizabeth. And I think that is the conversation we would be having differently had we had Judy Garland. So I'm excited to see what happens with this. But does that, again, so many places you could go with that question. I love that question.
Well, and I think the sort of connection between public pronouncements early on and public vision now is a really important trajectory. This is just a sort of personal nosiness question, but the impulse for her relatives to say she led a very mild life. It was all very staid and comfortable. You don't have to worry about her. She was not wild. Strikes me as something very like the introductions that you read by women writers in the 19th century that say, I'm just a woman, so, this is only my opinion, but I'm thinking maybe there might be some problems with the way that we treat our workforce and factories, but I'm only a lady, so. There's this very sort of self-deprecating, qualifying thing, which is highly gendered. And I'm wondering if you think that is part of where the impulse for her family to characterize her in certain ways comes from, or is there something else going on? Why that initial impulse so strongly?
I think we could see it negatively and positively. We
Okay.
could see it negatively as they're trying to cover their own tracks, right? They want to continue to live in the world where they don't have this relative who's seen as beyond the pale. Some of them rose in the world, some of them ended up titled, some of them ended up with money. They had a lot invested and being seen as on the right side of the polite line. And I'm not saying Jane Austen lived an impolite life. I'm saying she was almost wild. I think kind of like her heroine Elizabeth Bennet. She was going right up to the precipice of what was allowable and then not crossing over into the impolite. So I think there's some ways in which her family was really concerned about their own reputations when they were doing this. But there are also some ways, I think, in which they were protective of her. and not wanting her to be criticized, as many writers of the day were, for daring to raise their voice. And my parents and my aunt are here, and I know they would want to protect me from anybody who would criticize me in my work. I know they would. When we walked into the bookstore tonight, my aunt went up to a total stranger and said, "Here is the author. Do you want to see the author?" And put the book right in this total stranger's face. It was like I was mortified, but I also know how much she loved me. So, I do think that there is a sense in which they were also setting out to make sure that people were going to treat her and read her books without writing her off as on the wrong side of convention, because they wanted her to maintain a readership. That's also possible.
Yeah. Because they wanted to profit from her books, or because they wanted her name to have no tarnish attached?
Probably something of both. They did sell her the interest that they had in her copyrights. This was her sister Cassandra and her brother Henry in the early 1830s. They sold the remaining copyrights to the books they did control, and they made, a tidy, I think it was about 130 or 150 pounds off of it. Not small, but not a great amount either.
Right.
So, I think there was some money at stake, but interesting stuff you can find through research. The Austens ended up strangely connected with the Tennysons, and there were all of these things going on in the Cambridge world, the University of Cambridge world, where they were, hanging out with Darwin and the Darwin's relatives. So all of these great literary figures, collateral descendants and descendants, were hanging out together, and obviously they had a lot at stake in not being seen as the wrong kind of lady.
Right.
And any woman who published was, to some extent, the wrong kind of lady, because she wasn't passive, she wasn't quiet, she was raising her voice on the page, and that was not necessarily seen as a great idea. Good thing we're so different from that now.
Right.
Okay, maybe we're not quite different enough, but we're at least a little different, because here we are.
We're getting there, right? Okay, so I want to talk about the middle section of the book, which I think of as, so the middle section, the first section of the book is the section in which there are sort of new readings and rereadings of all of the novels that you know, and excuse me, as well as her juvenilia and some of her unpublished writing. The second section of the book is where you start to, it's like the Venn diagram of Jane Austen's life. The people she knew, the people she was related to, the people her family knew. And I keep thinking about this section of the book as the wild by association section. It's sort of like there were people all around her in her orbit who were sometimes scandalous, potentially kleptomaniacs. Well, one potential kleptomaniac. People who were potentially politically radical, who were involved in scandals, who were married to scandals. So I think the general argument of that section, if I can paraphrase it, might be that describing Jane Austen's life as sheltered is a sort of folly, given the people who surrounded her. But I'm wondering if you can sort of give us some sense of how it changes our understanding of Jane Austen to think about things other people did, as opposed to things she did, right? So we sort of get her ideas about wildness in that first section, but it's not about her behavior, it's not about her politics, it's not about her kleptomania. I'm not saying Jane Austen was a kleptomaniac. So why the, I'm not saying we shouldn't, I'm just saying, can you talk about why?
I think that's a great question. And for those who don't know, she had an aunt who was tried for shoplifting and who was acquitted. And this is well known. This is not a surprise in the biographies. But I tried to tell the story of what that would have meant for Jane Austen watching this happen, and just what a big deal it was in terms of news from that year. It was listed, it happened in 1800, 1799, 1800. It was listed as one of the most important events in 1800. Mrs. Lee Parrott is acquitted of shoplifting. So Napoleon, France, invades Egypt, and Mrs. Lee Parrott was acquitted of shoplifting. So, just to give you an idea of how incredibly visible this was at the time, I think that's important.
Yeah,
so,
right.
Why does that matter? This idea that she was sheltered, as you're saying, absolutely. But I think, too, people have looked at her writings and said, three or four families in a country village, this is all she could write. Because she didn't know anything else. poor Jane Austen, she never married, this is always the detail, right? She lived in this small place and she just had to look at the small lives around her and spin that into gold. And you know, I do think there is a sense in which she definitely was able to spin everyday life into gold. But it was an artistic choice she made. She did not have a lack of material. And the chapter, I think that's my favorite at the moment because it seems to get the most shock value out of people talking about it, is she was hanging out in London with an opera diva, a French opera diva, and a man who turned out to be a political, an international spy. He was like a prototype James Bond. They were all hanging out in the same drawing room, and a year after Jane Austen met them, both the opera diva and the international spy were assassinated. So, you know, this could be in her work. She could have written an incredible Gothic novel. These murders were bloody. She was reading about this in the paper, and it wasn't like something that happened over here. These were people she knew who experienced this. And so I think that she made this choice not to put that in her fiction should not be seen as some limitation, but an artistic, and I hope a respectable artistic choice, although we can argue about why she might have made it. Maybe there were market reasons. You know, maybe she knew where her talents would lie.
I mean, she wasn't living in the 1860s, so she didn't have sensation fiction
There you go.
begging her to write those things, right?
Yeah, and you know, she writes a kind of send-up with the Gothic novel, so it's clear that she's saying this isn't where I'm going to take my words and my talent. But it's not because she didn't have access to it, and to me that's what's important there.
And why? Okay, so why? Like, why do we need to know she had access to that? Or how does that? Maybe not why, but how does that help us rethink her stories of smaller communities or country towns or things that on the surface might appear a little bit more staid?
Right, and I, like most things with Jane Austen, my favorite thing to say to students is there isn't one answer. You know, we would all love to have one answer, right?
No.
But I think there are multiple ways that we can look at why she made this choice not to exploit this. There could be personal answers, there could be professional answers, but I think there were certainly some literary answers. And she was really good at skewering personalities and personality types, both the minor characters and the very complex heroes and heroines, in ways that still make them feel alive to many of us. To talk about these as real people, and I know I do these kinds of things with my husband, who's also an Austen scholar. We will look at people in our lives, and we might say, "Oh, that was kind of like what Mrs. Norris did." You know, it's a shorthand, right? But the fact that these kinds of descriptors continue to resonate 200 years later, 250 years later from her birth this year, says that she was really using her talents to their fullest.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's only a partial answer, but I think it's a question that we could sit here on for days and days talking about, and I would never get bored of it. But some of your ears might certainly.
Well, it's sort of connected to another thing, which I think is the particularly complicated question of her relationship or her family's relationship to abolition, right?
Yes.
There are documented and also researched new stuff in the book, ways that her brothers in particular are involved in abolitionist causes, largely, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, as I was trying to pay attention to dates, largely in ways that are after she's already died,
Yes,
right?
correct.
So these are not things that she's drawing directly on in her writing, because there's no sensible ghost writing by Jane Austen. But you're making an argument that there's a kind of family culture somehow there. And so I'm thinking about this in terms of the Legacies of British Slavery project and other ways of, like ways that I teach 19th century novels too, where part of what we're doing is trying to think about larger cultural contexts. So can you talk a little bit about why thinking about abolition and thinking about race is really important, even in novels in which it doesn't seem to be mentioned, or
Yes.
it seems to be very tangentially mentioned or barely mentioned?
Yeah, and I'm really proud of this part of the book because it is some new information that I found in the course of my research that I think allows us to be better speculators. But it used to be said that Jane Austen's family were quiet, conservative, apolitical country Tories. This was the line. And I'm not saying there weren't some that were that, but it was definitely a mixed, a politically divided family. This will perhaps resonate with some of you sitting in this room. It was a politically divided family. And I think it's really important to understand these lines in Austen, and there are really a handful of them, as well as one very interesting mixed race character, to say what was she going at with these few references. Often Austen doesn't tell us what to think. She raises questions. But I think once we see that she had three brothers who in the 1820s and afterward became very directly, politically, publicly engaged activists in the anti-slavery movement, we're having a different conversation. These are not apolitical people in her family. Half of her brothers made this choice. And I think we can chart a movement, or I've tried to chart a movement in her life from the late 18th century, where she certainly had a lot of relatives who were benefiting from the labor of enslaved people, including that potentially kleptomaniac aunt. Possibly kleptomaniac aunt. She was born in Barbados. Her family's wealth came at least in part from plantation wealth. And I think the Austens were, although they didn't profit directly from that enslaved labor, like many wealthy people at the time, were profiting indirectly or had family members who were profiting. But you can chart a movement in the family, or at least parts of it, from this more tacit acceptance of colonial exploitation into a greater engagement with ways in which it's problematic and unjust. And I do think Austen is very concerned with many kinds of injustice. And I think that this sense of her family's having these political engagements by the 1820s shows that maybe in the 18 teens, when she was still alive and still writing, these were conversations that she was a part of. It's speculation. I can't prove what Jane Austen thought, but the fact that she's got these three brothers who were not sitting at home saying nothing, doing nothing in their own little world, sheltered brothers, but I think brothers who were very much disagreeing with each other. And one, Henry Austen, went on to be a delegate in the Global Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840. And this hadn't been previously noticed. And I'm really excited to have put this together. And then after that, to have found her brother Charles in ways that he was writing to newspapers when he was working for the Royal Navy and enforcing the slave trade, the abolition of the slave trade. And that's a really moving section to me, although he ended up letting a slaver go inadvertently. So not all of these stories are happy, good time stories. Right. They're actually quite hard stories. But I think it's really important that we tell them. I think it's great to have debates about them. I hope we'll have more debates about what they mean.
I completely agree with you. I think one of the things that I love helping students think about is the way that larger cultural conversations make their way into fiction, even in small lines. I mean, you don't need to have a character give an impassioned speech in order to say, well, the author obviously knew this thing, right? There are ways, I think, that you make a really compelling case that clearly she understood where these fortunes were coming from and what some of the human cost of plantation slavery was. And that, seeing those things pop up in novels that have previously been described as sort of like quiet domestic drama kind of, country town things.
Which is so weird because Elizabeth Bennet is like the poster girl for how to learn to say no.
Right.
I mean, like this is women's positive refusals, right? I mean,
yeah. And I do think that the kind of case you make for why this is important really matters a lot. Makes me kind of long for more research actually about Austen in particular.
I think there will be. I think there are things left to discover. I think we have oversold the fact. There was someone in 1899, Walter Harris Pollock, who said, I need to apologize to you for writing this book because everything's already been said about Jane Austen, 1899. So, the fact that he was so wrong then gives me hope that in 2025 we're wrong. There's still more things to say and learn about Jane Austen. And this is one area where there's still a lot left, I think, to find.
Okay, I want to turn a little bit to ways that you think about how people think of Jane Austen now. There were two moments in the book that are kind of coming together for me in this. One is there's this great discussion of a series of portraits of Jane Austen which also includes some little anecdotes about people who show up, and you can sort of imagine it like the sort of, I don't know, museum curator version of Antiques Roadshow, where someone shows up and they're like, this one's Jane Austen, right? Like, I've got this painting, and it's definitely her. And it's definitely not, as far as we can tell, right? So there's that moment that you talk about, this sort of desire for paintings to be her, which aren't. And then there's also a moment where you talk about how people describe the Austen who wrote Sanditon as sort of crotchety and grumpy because she was mad at her public. And both of those seem to me to be about like projecting onto Jane Austen some vision of her that the audience wants her to be, as opposed to who she might actually be. And so do you think, so this to me seems like a fandom thing, right? Like fans want celebrities to be certain things, they want to imagine them in certain ways. Do you think that is different in any way for Jane Austen? Is it contiguous with other kinds of fandoms? Like how would you describe that sort of desire that people have now to imagine Jane in like to envision their own Jane, basically?
I do think there's a sense in which Jane Austen is a kind of Rorschach test, right? Like if you ask somebody what they think of her and they tell you, you can learn a lot about each other by your answer to that question. But I think one of the reasons why she can be seen so many different ways also explains some of her fandom, which is that for the time, she was not writing highly didactic novels where she told you at the end, here's the lesson. Sometimes her novels end with saying, it could be this or it could be this. And it's funny, usually it's a joke, but it's also serious in that she's giving you opportunities to draw your own conclusions. The thing you referred to at the beginning, I had a chance to do some research at the National Portrait Gallery in London in their archives. It was really fun, but also you get to see all of the curators arguing with each other over these images that they've been sent or art objects that they're looking at. And the line that you're thinking of, they say, well, this one really looks to me like palatable fudge. And I love this line that a bunch of curators are saying, this is not Jane Austen, it's just palatable fudge. And I do think there are some versions of Jane Austen that are passed around that are palatable fudge. There are versions of reading her, ways to read her, where you can just focus on the romance and the love story, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you're not going very deep. I think, to go beyond the palatable fudge level of reading her is to engage in some really deep philosophical questions often, some deeper social criticism, and these books can be reread and reread. And I think that also appeals to the fan aspect, the admiring aspects. These aren't just books to read once and toss aside. If you read once and you're really grabbed by them, you can reread them for the rest of your life, and they will read differently each time you pick them up. And I do love this line from the philosopher Gilbert Ryle, who he was asked in the mid-20th century, sir, do you read novels? The idea was, do philosophers read fiction because it's not as good? Was kind of the implication of the question to him. And he said, yes, I do, all 6 every year. Meaning all 6 of Jane Austen's major works. So I think that's a great answer. We can read all 6 novels every year. Yeah. I want you to read the Juvenilia. I want you to read the other things that I write, especially the Juvenilia. Her earliest writings are fantastic.
And hilarious.
Hilarious.
Yeah. I was so disappointed in the movie Love and Friendship, which was not what I thought it was going to be, because her Love and Friendship Juvenilia is hysterical, and it is not that movie.
Yeah, and so this is Whit Stillman's novel that's an adaptation of Lady Susan, which is also a fantastic story. And I did ask Whit about that, because I had an opportunity to meet him. And he told me that it was a marketing decision. The movie people thought no one would go see something called Lady Susan. It sounds too boring. But Love and Friendship, they would recognize, like Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility. They might notice that it's Jane Austen. They might be willing to go out and see this, so he stole this other title.
They might go see the movie thinking it was one thing.
Yes.
It was something else.
Bait and switch.
Totally.
Anyway, and also Whit Stillman's Metropolitan, which is a rewriting of Mansfield Park, set in the 1990s, is also just a really beautiful film that I recommend to you if you haven't seen.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask my last question.
Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, but it's kind of big. Who should read this book, your book? Like, who's going to love this book? And why should they read it now? Like, why do you think this book is important right now?
I think it's important because it's her 250th birthday. And how many authors are we still reading 250 years after their birth? First of all, I think that in itself is remarkable. Her reputation isn't suffering right now. We know this, right? She's not, at the moment, she's not in danger of disappearing.
Right.
If anything, the opposite, right? Maybe you're sick of hearing about Jane Austen. People keep asking me, are you sick of Jane Austen yet? And I think this is an important question for me to entertain every day. I say, am I sick of her today? No, I am not. And I hope that will continue. I hope that will continue. So I hope that the people who pick up this book are people who are Jane curious, who are like, what's the big deal about all of this? You should know that the first third has incredible amounts of plot spoilers, and so if you're new to it, you're going to start with all the plot spoilers, and if that bothers you, don't read that section. But I hope that there is something in here for the serious Janeite, those of us who are committed to reading these texts, all 6 every year and beyond, as well as to people who are just wondering what's the deal about her in her 250 year, her sesquicentennial. I hope that it appeals across that range. But of course, if you are very convinced that she is mild and prim and proper, this book is probably not going to be your sweet spot. But I hope you'll want to argue with me about it, and I'd be interested to hear where you think I've got it right. I do think I've gone for her legitimate wild side. I've tried to find places where there is good speculation, where there's actual evidence. That's what I've tried to do here.
Yeah. I think that it's great for people to read books that they might disagree with. Like, I think this is, as well as people who think, okay, maybe I feel like I know all these things and here's going to be more. So I wholeheartedly endorse that answer. We have a little time. We purposefully wanted to save time for you all to ask some questions. So thank you, first of all, for this great conversation, but we'd like to open it up to you. So who has some questions? There's already one in the back. Yeah.
What do you think are contemporary authors that are really in the spirit, like real heir apparents?
Yeah, and this is a question I wish I were better at answering. The truth is I read so much, my kids make fun of me. It's like if it was published after 1900, probably I haven't read it or haven't read it yet. So in a way, I'm like a really bad person to answer this. I can tell you, people bring up Sally Rooney's name, and I think that is an interesting name to throw out there. Others of you may have other names you want to put in the mix. But I also have written a piece that would say this is the wrong question to ask. That we're not going to find the most interesting new authors to read in the past or the present if we're holding Jane Austen up as like the standard. I hope that we have a literary culture and a literary world where we're not just looking for more Jane Austens. Wonderful as she is, but I think that the new geniuses aren't going to be the ones who remind us of the old ones necessarily.
Do you think that she wrote things that we don't know about, like under pseudonyms or?
So I have one chapter where I talk about what might be her first piece of published writing, and a magazine that her brothers edited called The Loiterer, and it's a short fictional letter signed Sophia Sentiment, and I think that's possibly her. I will be very surprised if we end up with undiscovered other texts by her. I'll be very surprised, but I'm not close to this idea. Do you have evidence?
Well, she was busy writing those other novels, so.
That's right. That's right. I think she had a pretty incredible output for her 41 years with the 6 full novels, the 3 juvenilia volumes. It's a pretty incredible output. Unfortunately, only 160 letters have survived out of what we estimate would have been several thousand that she wrote in that lifetime. So if more letters come into the vision, I'll be thrilled, and it will tell us a lot more about how she thought beyond the fictional world that she was creating. I hope some of those might still arise. I'll be surprised if she was writing for the magazines, or if she was writing without signing her name to it. She said she liked pewter, by which she means she liked money. So I think she was very interested in selling these books, but she really didn't have much of a chance to succeed on that financial level until her 30s, until the 18 teens. It's a great question, and as I say, if it comes, I'll be thrilled.
I was so struck by the discoveries and the research, and I just found myself wondering, how do you find the new in a subject so deeply researched? She's been studied for a
So my father taught me from an early age how to keep digging into information. My father has probably the most incredible collection of Minnesota high school hockey statistics of any person I know on the planet. I grew up in White Bear Lake, for those of you who don't know. I went to Hillbury High School, I went to Oxford University, as I mentioned. So I got to go along with my father to see a lot of these games and then to watch him record these facts. And so, my mother was the one who first put Pride and Prejudice before me, but it was my father who taught me how to research. And I'm really grateful, Dad, for your showing me how to dig into material that other people were like, oh, I've seen too much of that. Like, why do you need another score? Why do you need to dig deeper into what happened during that game? But I love the research discovery part. And you know how difficult it can be to find a needle in a haystack. I feel really lucky that Arizona State University has given me the resources to travel to some of the most incredible archives in the world, but also subscribes to some of these full-text newspaper databases that have, I can triangulate the information. So you get lucky, but also if you dig hard enough and you know what you're looking at, you might find something that other people didn't recognize was meaningful.
There's a hand here.
So there are so many film adaptations, and then there's spin-offs and fan fiction adaptations, and I just finished watching Death Comes to Pemberley last night. And so do you have any, so this would be, I guess, a personal response, but like, how do you vet those? Do some of them really aggravate you? Do some of them really appeal to you? And what's your personal criteria for all of these?
Yeah, I don't like them all equally, right? But I think I've become much more open to possibility and less interested in fidelity. So for instance, with that Netflix Persuasion that came out recently, that many Jane-ites were really upset because it was not their Anne Elliot. And my feeling was, okay, you made a Fleabag Persuasion, that this is okay. If this brings more people to this text, especially of the age group and the demographic that they're trying to reach, I'm okay with that. I think there are parts of that adaptation that aren't so great, but some of them are quite clever. It's just not the nobody Anne Elliot, right? She's a break the third wall, drinking wine, snarky Anne Elliot. I think the more room we make for each generation to have some kind of access or inroads to this text and these characters, the more likely she is to be around. Each time she moves to a different medium, each time there is a remaking of her for a younger generation of viewers, listeners, readers, I think, to me, this is for the greater good. One of the things I like to tell my students is, for me, these books, these amazing, incredible books by the greatest novelist in the English language, as far as I'm concerned, show us how an individual might live a meaningful life in a world that's deeply unfair. They aren't a blueprint for how to change the world. They aren't a blueprint for the ways the world needs to be changed. But they do help an individual think about navigating. So inasmuch as an adaptation does something like that, I'm generally, approving of it and okay with it. And I don't read nearly as widely in the continuations as many people do. As some of you know, you could do this, for all time. There's so many of them now, thousands. Do you have an answer to that? What do you do?
I don't know. I guess if it tries to tip the hat and does its own thing, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
If it says, oh no, we're doing Jane Austen's whatever, and then it really is taking huge liberties, then I tend to get a little antsy with it.
Fair. Fair.
Yeah, the question in the back.
Yeah. Is there a personal trait or virtue that comes to mind that kind of fuels your passion for Jane, and possibly is that kind of sustainable, that stands the test of time or generations, that can inspire people
Yeah.
250 years
So I first learned the British novel and women's literature from Professor Kathy Nichol, and to me, reading this was a feminist act, and making sense of Jane Austen was looking for ways that proto-feminist characters were part of literary history. So I think that's what first drew me to her. Is that what you're asking me, Mark? That's what first drew me to her. And I can thank Kathy for teaching me all of the ways to find that in the history of the novel. It was not something I knew much about. I'm a first-generation college student. My parents worked very hard to give me access to an education, And I think, to me, Jane Austen is also about that. It's not just about aspiring for economic comfort, it's not just about aspiring for a good partner, husband. It's about a kind of educational aspiration and a world in which your partner cares if you're smart. Because I think Jane Austen's heroes want smart women. They find smart women attractive, and that's another thing that really appealed to me about these novels, especially early on in my life.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead there and then over here.
So I'm curious what you think kind of accounts for the gender divide in interest in Jane Austen. Because I was shocked in your chapter, like when you talked about she had like a huge male fan base, like they called themselves Mansfield Parkers or something. And like I just feel like that's not so much the case now. Like I'm also part of JASNA, and we're like probably like 98% women too. So just thoughts.
Is that the Minnesota region? You think
Yeah.
it's 98%? Yeah, I think nationally it's more like it's between 80 and 90, isn't it? You know. Anyway, I think so my book from 2017, The Making of Jane Austen, talks about early 20th century men's club. Men about town, elite men who were arguing over Jane Austen, and some of them were very much a fan of Jane Austen. And there was a period where scholars thought, oh, Jane Austen was a man's author in the early 20th century, and then she switched to a sort of chick lit version of her. That turns out not to be right, because there were also suffragists. At the same time that these men's club readers were saying Jane Austen belongs to us, there were suffrage leaders out with Jane Austen banners marching in the street in 1908 for women's rights. So I think there's always been this push and pull over who loved her and why. Was the Shakespeare of the novel? Was it Jane Austen or Sir Walter Scott? This was a question that elites and many men were asking. But at the same time, there were many women writers who were picking up the mantle of Jane Austen and rewriting. So I think there's always been a bit more of a gender divide. Now I think, and this is unfortunate, but I think that when many college students see Jane Austen in the title, they think that is a course for women. And I think that's something that maybe we need to change. And I hope it's changeable. I see it in my own classes. It's maybe 80-20, depending on how it counts. Right? So I don't know if you have ideas about how to shift this, but I think chick lit is absolutely the wrong label to put on what she was doing, but I think it's also one of the reasons why there is such a wide fandom and wide readership now. So she's benefited from the rise of education for women, she's benefited from this sense of chick lit, but we've also lost access to some of the history of the men who read her and loved her. Aldous Huxley's father, believe it or not, he once said, men will not, this was in the early 20th century, men should really read Jane Austen in their early 20s, like maybe their mid-20s, because this is about the first moment they could be mature enough to understand her. My sons, I have two sons who are 19 and 21, and they think Jane Austen is just garbage. They've grown up their whole life hearing all about Jane Austen from their parents, and they cannot get away from her fast enough. But my hope is that maybe Aldous Huxley's father is right. And by the time they're in their mid-20s, they'll come around.
There was a question here.
I was just going to ask about the role of privilege in Austen's works, because she does a beautiful job of walking that very fine line. She's a woman of privilege, she's able to write, yet we see characters like Christine treated with so much respect. Given that many people who read Jane Austen and study her also walk that fine line, what can we learn about how to advocate for the individuals Jane advocated for in our lives based on the work Jane offered?
Listen, I think that is a beautiful question just to leave it in the air for all of us. I think it would be wrong for me in some ways to try to answer that, because I think Jane Austen's fiction is about raising that very question that you just so eloquently gave us. But I will try to answer, because it's not fair to say. It's not fair to say, great question, no answer. I think that, listen, she's dealing with middle class women, and she is not, I think, dealing as much with the working class as she might have, for sure. And I think it's unfair if we don't acknowledge that. But for educated women of this period, she is trying to move the dial for more possibility. I mean, her own career is an example of more possibility. So does she go far enough? Does she go wide enough? Probably not. But I think she gives us a way to look at these questions, these groups, these inequities, and to ask better questions. And then it's up to us to decide for our own time. How do we want to respond to this opening up? How do we want to take what was true in 1811 and say, what do we use from that now in 2025 in a very different context? So that's as best I can do with that. It's a beautiful question.
Beautiful answer. Thank you.
Somebody right at the back there, yeah.
So I'm gonna combine his question and her question with the gender. What aspect of Jane drew your husband to be an Austen scholar?
Oh, see, this is where now you're going to make me answer for George. That's tough. So there was a book that came out a few years ago called Among the Janeites by a journalist named Deborah Yaffe. And she interviewed quirky Janeite weirdos, among which George and I were included. And so there's a chapter in this book describing our courtship and all of the things that we went through to meet each other and come together as a couple. And it's, he loved Mansfield Park. He was a Mansfield Parker. And I did not love Mansfield Park, so our first conversation was kind of a literary fight. But I think that he would say he read Jane Austen. He read Frances Burney, one of the authors that Jane Austen most admired and loved, who both wrote before her and after her, because Burney lived a long life. And he would say these are just incredibly beautiful, brilliant novels. I think he would agree with me about that. But I don't feel it's probably not fair for me to answer for him. I should let his words stand on their own. But the give and take, the book caring deeply about these books and fighting over them was definitely generative for us. We used to teach a team taught course to large lectures, so it was 100 students. And we would go and fight in front of the students. And it was a fun class for us to teach, and mostly the students seemed to enjoy it. But we did get one evaluation once that said, it makes me so deeply uncomfortable when the professors fight in front of the class. And I just thought, I don't know what household they grew up in, but clearly it was very unlike the one I grew up in. And so, I think, Kathy, that's the best I could do to answer for George.
I think we have time for one last question if there's anybody who has one more. Yeah.
I have a question. So I haven't read the book yet, so I'm wondering what you found out about Jane Austen that shocked you the most.
Ooh, that's a good one. Wow. It's hard to be shocked, I think, because of how much writing there is already about, you're standing on the shoulder of giants, right? So I don't know that I would say I was shocked by finding the information about her three brothers, but it was shocking to find a kind of needle in a haystack 3 times in a row over the course of the past 4 years. So that shocked me. And I can tell you, again, trick from my father, I was triangulating information, and Henry Austen was, at the end of his life, going by the Reverend H.T. Austen. And apparently, previous scholars hadn't done enough digging into that name. And once I realized that he went by other names, all sorts of things popped up that I knew it was the same guy, but other people hadn't recognized. So to me, that's shocking, because we think we're so good. We think we're excellent researchers. But if you find someone was using a different name, and you can drill down into that in the source material, all sorts of things that should have been found years ago, I was surprised, maybe shocked, to find were there for the picking, finding, describing. I'm just so honored at the number of classmates of mine who are here, just really honored. And we've been reading books alongside each other and having conversations about our lives alongside each other for decades. If you're a new friend, I'm also very happy that you're here. I hope that you'll find things to enjoy in Jane Austen and in this book. Are there things you want to add to that?
No, I just wanted to say thank you all for coming, for asking such great questions, and thank you, Devoney, for writing this book and talking to us about Jane Austen.
Long